Thank you very much, Jamal, and I hope you feel better soon. Feel free to take leave whenever you feel you need to. It's really my great honor and pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, the linguist, lexicographer, and self-proclaimed all-around word nut, Ben Zimmer. Ben has, for the past 11 years or so, been the language columnist for the Wall Street Journal, where he actually pioneered their language column entitled Word on the Street, and where he's offered insightful but also incredibly entertaining analyses of the histories and changes in meanings and uses of words and phrases like the fall guy, hooligan, fireworks, amateur, cabin fever, green light, I think most recently, and many, many others, a few of which I think he's going to talk about tonight. Before that, he was a language columnist for the Boston Globe, and even earlier for the New York Times, where he succeeded William Safire as the regular author of the weekly column on language in the New York Times weekly magazine. Myself being a regular reader of that column, that's where I first took note of his really excellent analyses of the meanings of words and their changes over time. He's also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and co-host of the Slate podcast, Spectacular Vernacular, which you should all check out. His expertise on language has been widely recognized. He's served as the editor for the American Dictionaries at Oxford University Press, consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary, and executive editor of vocabulary.com and the Visual Thesaurus. In 2014, he was the recipient of the inaugural Linguistics Journalism Award from the Linguistic Society of America. He is chair of the New Words Committee for the American Dialect Society, where he oversees the Society's Word of the Year proceedings, currently underway, I believe, for this year's Word of the Year, and helps prepare the quarterly feature Among the New Words in the journal American Speech. In 2021, he was named the first ever vocabulary judge for the Scripps National Spelling Bee. And I also learned today, as I was doing a little digging to prepare this introduction, that Ben joined the National Puzzlers League at the tender age of 9 and was actually creating his own word puzzles even earlier than that. He later went on to study linguistics as an undergraduate at Yale University and linguistic anthropology as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, where he conducted linguistic fieldwork in Indonesia. He's the recipient of a number of fellowships, including from the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright Program, and the Ford Foundation. And in some ways, I'd like to think that his presence here is tonight is something of a homecoming for him, since nearly 2 decades ago, he was given a role here at Penn as a research associate at our Institute for Research in Cognitive Science, during which he began contributing to a collective blog called Language Log that focused on language and linguistics. And these were contributions that were later anthologized in 2 volumes. And I just want to note that his contributions to those 2 volumes were particularly noted as exceptional. And I suspect that that may have been what launched him on the path that he has subsequently taken. So I think Penn, in some small way, played a role in his progression. But despite that, I want you to join me in either welcoming him or welcoming him back to Penn and giving our tonight's speaker a very warm welcome. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out, especially when there's playoff baseball going on right now. Matters to some of us in the audience, I know. Thanks so much to Jamal and to Lisa. Wonderful introduction, and thank you for that. It's wonderful to take part in this forum on keywords, and it does feel like a bit of a homecoming, or at least it feels like I'm coming full circle. So the book by Raymond Williams called Keywords, which inspired this whole forum, was a text that I first encountered back in my grad school days at the University of Chicago 25 or so years ago. And that's about when I first met Lisa Mitchell, when I was doing my my linguistic anthro research on the Sundanese-speaking area of West Java and Indonesia. Lisa at the time was a grad student at Columbia. So Lisa ended up coming to Penn here, and while I ended up pursuing a career outside of academia in lexicography and language commentary, Penn did play an important role in my career development, thanks in large part to Mark Liberman, who is here in the audience. So Mark is professor of linguistics here at Penn and director of the Linguistic Data Consortium, and with Jeffrey Pullum, they co-founded Language Log, the group blog on linguistic topics. And when Mark and Jeff were kind enough to invite me to be a regular contributor to Language Log about coming up on 20 years ago is when that happened, it really did sort of change my whole trajectory, really, and made me think about how I could sort of write about language for a more general audience. And so at a time when I was really trying to figure out my next steps and moving on from academia, that was tremendously valuable in sort of helping me develop a voice that has served me well over the years. Just seeing how to do the slides here. Oops. Okay, so as I mentioned, I first encountered this book by Raymond Williams, his 1976 book, Keywords, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society, when I was in grad school. And looking back, I think it kind of had a bigger influence on me than I could have realized at the time, as I've sort of moved on and tried to combine approaches from lexicography, linguistics, and cultural history in my own work. So, I went after grad school, I worked as a lexicographer and started writing language columns. And in my columns, especially, for the ones that I've done for the Times and the Globe and the Wall Street Journal, I like to think of what I'm doing as a form of narrative lexicography, telling stories about words from their origins and how they move through various cultural and social and political worlds. And in a way, Raymond Williams pioneered that approach with his essays in this book, Keywords, digging into the complex histories of all sorts of significant terms like culture or hegemony or organic, romantic. The book that he wrote in 1976, he ended up expanding a bit in a 1983 edition. And there have been other scholars who've sort of taken up the keywords mantle as well, building on the work of Raymond Williams. So on the left, that's Bennett, Grossberg, and Morris. They published new keywords in 2005. And in 2018, Colin McCabe and Holly Janacek edited Keywords for Today, a 21st Century Vocabulary. And that came out of something called the Keywords Project. And you can actually find lots of information on that project online at keywords.pitt.edu. It's got lots of useful information and commentary, and it's starting with an attempt to define what is a keyword, what makes a word a keyword, in the kind of the Raymond Williams tradition of that, and how that word itself has kind of taken on new forms. So they write, a keyword is a socially prominent word that is capable of bearing interlocking, yet sometimes contradictory and commonly contested contemporary meanings. And they also give a number of typical criteria for this, keywords in this Raymond Williams tradition. So a keyword is likely to be, 1, currently used, 2, polysemous. Some people say polysemous, some people say polysemous, but either way, it means it carries multiple meanings. Categorical, in the sense that it sort of carves out a particular category of social or cultural concepts and practices. Number 4, it's actively contested and part of a cluster of interrelated words which typically co-occur. I won't get into all of this now, but you can read more on this website if you're interested. But as the Keywords Project notes, this word keyword has itself become polysemous and contested in 21st century usage. And they say if you Google the word keyword now and look through your first 20 results, chances are you will find only references to using target words in searchable databases or for finding relevant web pages. This is a different sense of keyword, illustrating the general point made about the polysemy of words. Indeed, this is overwhelmingly how the word keyword gets used these days. My wife actually works in digital marketing, and I'm constantly overhearing her work calls where they're talking about leveraging keywords and how companies bid on keywords that appear in search ads, those ads that you see when you Google something, or other search engines as well. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry now, all built on keywords. It's also crucial to the business of dictionaries these days, because dictionary sites rely on online traffic from search engines like Google. And dictionary companies are constantly monitoring what keywords are being entered in search queries coming from a search engine like Google, or else what people enter directly in the search boxes on dictionary websites. In fact, if you go to merriam-webster.com, you'll see right at the top of the homepage a list of the top lookups in real time. They update it every 30 seconds. It's a sort of a fun feature that they added to their homepage. And it's fascinating to sort of see what people are looking up. People don't just look up words to check on the spelling, for instance, although they do that. Oftentimes the lookups are for these sort of Raymond Williams style keywords, these kind of broad categorical terms with contested meanings that become politically charged, and different, different people, will invest them with political meaning. In the screenshot here, which is from last year, from August 2023, you can see that coming in at number 5 is fascism, and isms in general are very often looked up. And above fascism, you can see words like accurate, respect, and disparage. These are also broad terms with potentially contested meanings, and I'm not sure exactly what was driving those lookups on that particular day, but I do know what was driving the number 1 lookup. You can see it's racketeer. If you were looking up racketeering, you would be directed to the entry for the verb racketeer for Merriam-Webster. And that happened to be when a grand jury in Georgia returned indictments for former President Donald Trump and 18 others, charging them with operating a criminal organization in an effort to overturn the 2020 election. So when a word is in the news, like racketeering, and people are wondering, what does that mean exactly? Where does it come from? Why do we call it that? That has been my cue to write something about it. And so for the Wall Street Journal that week, I wrote a column on racketeering and looking at how it developed from this noisy word racket and how that then got applied to organized crime. And then from racket, you get racketeer and racketeering, leading to laws like the RICO Act covering racketeering. Let's look at some more recent Merriam-Webster lookups from August 22nd, 2024. Sovereignty at number 4 is a Raymond Williams style keyword for sure, a highly contested term given the developments between Ukraine and Russia, or Israel and Gaza, and so forth. I'm not sure if anyone might know why fizz, pie, and bubble were being looked up that day. Does anyone have any guesses why that might be? Well, those words were all featured in Connections, the online word game from the New York Times. So Wordle and Connections these days are very often driving a lot of these lookups, and sometimes they can sort of swamp these results for the top lookups for Merriam-Webster. Now, if you've been paying attention to social media, you may know why the word demure came in at number 1 and why that might have been trending in August. And I'm hoping I can show you a video.
You see how I do my makeup for work? very demure, very mindful. Very demure, very mindful. I don't come to work with a I don't look like a clown when I go to work. I don't do too much. I'm very mindful while I'm at work. See how I look very presentable? The way I came to the interview is the way I go to the job.
See how I do this when I drink from the bottle? Very demure.
We have all the flavors.
Very mindful.
But you can hear the audio of Jules LeBron. She's a TikTok influencer, and she ended up sort of popularizing this word demure, as you heard from her saying, very demure, very mindful. So I ended up writing about demure, and that's a word that could do well in the American Dialect Society's Word of the Year voting. That's, as Lisa mentioned, something that I oversee, and the next one held in January will be right here in Philadelphia. I'm happy to talk about that later if we have time. So Jules LeBron basically sort of made this word her own. And it's a great example of how words in our language are constantly open to reinterpretation and resignification. And these days it could be a proudly plus-size trans woman on TikTok who is leading the way to put a new spin on an old word in our lexicon. So all of this is part of the rich cultural context of a word as it is used in practice. And that's context that can be very difficult to encompass in the tersely worded definitions in a dictionary entry. Well, Raymond Williams understood how dictionary entries, even those in the magisterial Oxford English Dictionary, are necessarily limited. And if you check out the introduction to keywords, which you can actually find on that Keywords Project website that I mentioned, he describes how he was inspired to write these essays by looking up words in the OED. And the OED, of course, has historical entries that are supported by written citations for the various meanings of a lexical item. And his whole process started way back in the mid-1950s. He was working on a book called Culture and Society, and he was trying to sort of understand this sort of the cultural history of the word culture itself. And he talks about this shock of recognition that he felt when he saw how the OED entry for that word helped him trace how the meanings of the word culture have evolved. But Williams was also aware that relying on dictionaries to illuminate the meanings of words will only get you so far. So he observed that when people consult dictionary definitions, it's often as a kind of a rhetorical move. So he says, when people say, I see from my Webster, or I find from my Oxford Dictionary, often what's at issue is, quote, a difficult term in an argument. And the appeal to the authority of the dictionary is, quote, to appropriate a meaning which fitted the argument and to exclude those meanings which were inconvenient to it, but which some benighted person had been so foolish as to use. So I reread the introduction to keywords, preparing for this talk, and I was really struck by his nuanced take on sort of the limitations of dictionaries. Even though he used the OED as a kind of a springboard for his essays, and each essay sort of incorporates things from the OED, he points out, that the dictionaries that most people consult, as he put it, list a range of meanings, all of them current. Then you can, of course, consult a historical dictionary like the OED and uncover a history and complexity of meanings, conscious changes or consciously different uses, innovation, obsolescence, specialization, extension, overlap, transfer, and so forth. These are all things that you can use these longer historical entries in the OED to piece together, but even that will only get you so far. And as Williams wrote about the OED, that he found that it's often constrained by the presuppositions of orthodox opinion in the period that the dictionary was originally written, which was from the 1880s to the 1920s. So Raymond Williams, who was this progressive Welsh cultural critic and thinker and scholar, he died in 1988. And actually, the very next year, Oxford University Press finally published a second edition of the OED, and that incorporated supplements that were published in the 1970s and 80s and updating many of those more antiquated entries. Then in 2000, work began on the third edition, which is still ongoing and something I serve as a consultant for. Lots of newly added and revised entries available online at oed.com. But even though the OED is no longer so reflective of this bygone era, it's still, Williams makes an important point here, I think, about the OED or really any dictionary, that despite what he calls an air of massive impersonality, a dictionary nonetheless reflects personal choices, individual choices that the editors make, and those choices can reflect social, historical, and ideological positioning. One final point that Williams makes about the OED is that it was developed at a time when, as he put it, the written language was taken as the real source of authority, with the spoken language, in effect, derived from it, whereas now it is much more clearly realized that the real situation is usually the other way around. So he observes that relying strictly on written sources might be fine for tracing the history of a word like psychology, but it's not going to work as well with a word like job, which he says the real developments of meaning must have occurred in everyday speech well before they entered the written record. So the OED and other dictionaries still prioritize written sources because they're easier to document. In my own work, I've attempted to expand what counts as historical evidence to take in spoken use, but it still requires evidence. Fortunately, these days we get plenty of spoken evidence, for instance, on social media, as with Jules Lebron on TikTok with the use of that word demure. Just an example to show the difficulties of relying on written sources. Interjections are notoriously difficult to trace historically, precisely because they develop in spoken interaction and may only be recorded in writing much, much later. One such interjection that I researched back in 2012 when I was writing the column for the Boston Globe is meh, that expression of indifference, MEH. At the time, back in 2012, Mitt Romney's presidential campaign was frequently described as meh. He was even nicknamed Meh Romney by some observers. But before meh could be used that way, like as an adjective, it was an interjection, one that derived from Yiddish, as it turns out. But how could you track that history? Well, in this case, we're fortunate that there was a lexicographer about a century ago, a lexicographer of Yiddish, who was paying attention in the fourth edition of his Yiddish, English, Hebrew dictionary. Alexander Harkavi included an entry for the interjection meh, written in Hebrew characters here. He defined it as an interjection meaning be it as it may, and an adjective meaning so-so, which is actually pretty close to how we use it now. And he also defined it as a bleating interjection, suggesting that it was originally imitative of a goat or sheep. Well, one difficulty in tracking interjections is that when they appear in writing, they can appear in many different forms. So, for instance, meh has been written in various ways, and sometimes it's been spelled actually mneh, M-N-E-H, M-N-Y-E-H, and so forth. We could see actually the poet W.H. Auden used it in a 1969 poem called Moon Landing, where he was expressing some indifference about Neil Armstrong on the moon. He wrote this when he was living in New York and presumably picked up the Yiddishism there when he said, worth going to see, I can well believe it. Worth seeing, mneh, M-N-E-H. So there can be all these sort of different forms of an interjection before it might settle into something more conventional. in the case of meh, it was really The Simpsons that that we can thank for kind of making it popular in the way that it was when I was writing about it in 2012. Again, I have a video here.
Kids, how would you like to go to Blockoland?
Meh.
But the TV gave me the impression that...
We said meh. M-E-H. Meh.
I was really curious to see how did this word sort of break into such mainstream usage? And it seemed like the Simpsons writers played a very important role in that story. So I started contacting writers for the Simpsons, asking who was responsible on the writing staff, and everybody said, oh, that was John Swartzwelder. Now, John Swartzwelder was actually the most prolific of the early Simpsons writers, but he kind of dropped off the map in 2004. He stopped writing for the show, and no one really ever saw him again. You can see this is one of the few photos of John Swartzwelder here. But I was really intent on figuring this out, and so I did find a way to get in touch with him and send him a message. And even though people were saying, "Oh, you'll never get through to him. He's the J.D. Salinger of comedy writing." But I did actually find a way to send him a message, and he responded, I guess because this word meh meant so much to him. And so he wrote to me. I had originally heard the word from an advertising writer named Howie Krakow back in 1970 or 71, who insisted it was the funniest word in the world. Well, Howie Krakow is actually still alive. He's in his early 80s. He self-publishes humorous books, and I just Googled him and found that on Amazon for his bio, he proudly takes credit for his role in popularizing meh, which is nice to see. This is the type of research that's necessary to track down an elusive word like meh and really sort of figure out its trajectory when dictionaries are really not going to help you very much at all. Now, besides interjections, taboo language can be hard to document as well, because this is the type of language that's often deemed unfit to appear in mainstream publications. Even dictionaries dictionaries have long resisted including some of the most common taboo items in our vocabulary. And since I'm here at Penn, I would be remiss not to talk about the great Lila Gleitman, the longtime professor of psychology and linguistics who passed away in 2021. In May 2017, at the annual conference of the Association for Psychological Science, Gleitman sat down for an interview about her career, and her recollections went back to her early days as a grad student in linguistics at Penn in the late 1950s. And there she is. She recalled arriving to study at Penn with the linguist Zelig Harris, only to find that no grant money had been secured for her. She took a job with a psychologist named Harold Rashkis at the Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute. Rashkis, it turned out, had been hired as a consultant by the editors at Merriam-Webster who were working on the new unabridged dictionary, Webster's Third. And as Gleitman tells the story, Rashkis relied on the resident linguist in the office, really just a first-year linguistics grad student, to work on defining words that were being edited for Webster's Third. One word that she was asked to work on was particularly memorable, and here I'm afraid I have a video of her talking.
All right, so tell us about that famous word that you got into the dictionary.
Oh, yeah. So this was also wonderful because, believe it or not, among the psychological words was the word fuck. And actually, it was quite interesting. We won't talk about that, but those of you who have thought about symmetrical predicates can realize that fuck is quite an interesting word, like marry or equal or so forth. It behaves in very interesting ways. So that was my first approach to that. But the interesting thing is the upshot. Forever, I've taken it as my chief accomplishment in life that I'm the gal who put the word fuck in the dictionary.
Now, after After Gleitman did this interview, a mutual friend who is here with us, Cynthia McLemore, suggested that I talk to her about all of this, and I was very pleased to do so. But first I had to break the news to her that saying that she was the gal who put fuck in the dictionary was not quite accurate. But she hadn't sort of continued in lexicography at all after this work that she did back as a first-year grad student. So she didn't know that the word fuck didn't actually make it into Webster's Third when it was published in 1961. In fact, the president of Merriam-Webster, Gordon J. Gallen, instructed the chief editor, Philip B. Gove, to remove what had been drafted for fuck for fear of public backlash. I ended up looking into this and going into the Merriam-Webster archives to see what I could find about this. And here you can see that Philip Gove, the chief editor himself, had drafted entries for fuck as a verb, fuck as a noun, and fuck up. This is all from 1958, so basically right when Lila Gleitman was the first-year grad student and doing that work for Harold Rashkis. So that, the consulting that they did ended up being reflected in what Philip Gove was trying to put in the dictionary. And in fact, this is how it would have appeared. This is from 1959. These entries joined others between Fuchsite and Fucoid in the typeset manuscript in 1959. But then Gordon Gallen, the president of Merriam-Webster, sent a memo telling him to remove those entries. So Gallen wrote, while recognizing the widespread usage of these terms in vulgar and sometimes colloquial speech, it is my judgment that their inclusion would be misinterpreted to the extent so as to seriously affect the sale of the third edition. Gove, the editor, strenuously objected, but he was overruled by Gallen, and the entries were removed from the galley proofs. It would take until 1973, actually, for Merriam-Webster to publish entries for fuck in its collegiate dictionary. And that is finally when Lila Gleitman's work as a Penn graduate student, it finally paid off all those years later. But we can see how dictionary editors can be constrained by institutional and ideological forces, and how that can be reflected in the coverage or lack of coverage of contentious lexical items, what Raymond Williams might call keywords, although I'm not sure if Raymond Williams would agree that the F word should be considered a keyword, but I consider it one. I want to discuss a word that Raymond Williams definitely, I think, would consider a keyword, and one that would also illuminate some of his observations about dictionaries and how they're used, and that involves the highly contentious term racism. And Williams, in fact, included an entry on race and racial, including discussion of the term racism, in the second edition of his book, Keywords. And it was also discussed in an entry for race in that newer book, Keywords for Today, that I mentioned. So in June 2020, at a time when Black Lives Matter protests were in full swing, after the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, a dictionary definition made headlines. And the definition that drew so much attention was the one that Merriam-Webster gave for the word racism. And the big news was that the dictionary was going to be revising its entry for the term after hearing from a young Black activist from Missouri named Kennedy Mitchum. And Mitchum had contacted Merriam-Webster because she was dissatisfied with what she found when she looked up racism in Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. She did lots of interviews at the time. This got tons of attention. Maybe you saw some of it. She was on CNN and MSNBC and so forth. She told CNN at the time, the way that racism occurs in real life is not just prejudice. It's the systemic racism that is happening for a lot of Black Americans. So as we'll see, there was some acknowledgement of what we might call systemic racism in the entry, but Merriam-Webster's editor-at-large, Peter Sokolowski, explained at the time that the idea of an asymmetrical power structure could be expressed more clearly, so it made sense to revisit the entry to highlight the systemic nature of racism more clearly. And Sokolowski was quoted as saying, this is the kind of continuous revision that is part of the work of keeping the dictionary up to date based on rigorous criteria and research we employ in order to describe the language as it is actually used. So at the time, in 2020, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, and I timed it to coincide with Merriam-Webster's publication of the new entry online. There was this big flurry of attention that happened in June, but it wasn't really until August, or actually early September, when the new entry actually finally appeared. And so in this piece, I tried to dispel various misunderstandings about the process of how this type of work goes on. How does a dictionary entry for a word like racism get revised? And I also provided historical background on how the definition of racism had evolved over the years in Merriam-Webster's dictionaries. And that history revealed a far more complex story than the media narratives at the time, which generally framed it as basically the dictionary gets woke, was sort of one way of expressing it. And depending on one's political perspective, that might be seen as either a laudable step in the path to progressive enlightenment or as a capitulation to the forces of political correctness. We saw lots of arguments on both sides of that at the time. I want to talk about the history of how racism entered the dictionary in the first place, but before we get into that, here's exactly how the entry was revised in 2020. This is what the entry looked like before the revision. And you can see that there are 3 senses given. First one is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That part wasn't changed much. The word primary was replaced by fundamental, and another change was taking sense 3, racial prejudice or discrimination, folding it into sense 1. So that became part of sense 1. But the big change happened with 2A, where before it said a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles. That part was completely revised. So now what it says is the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another, specifically white supremacy sense 2, with a cross-reference to that entry, which was also new for that update to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And among the examples, the phrase institutional racism is given. And finally, sense 2B, a political or social system founded on racism, was expanded. So now it says a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So you can see that about 50% of the revised text is new. Now, racism and racist, those words are surprisingly recent additions to the English lexicon. You won't find those words in the writings of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Beecher Stowe or Abraham Lincoln. So the OED currently dates racism, the word racism in English, to 1903 and racist to 1919. That seems surprisingly new, I think, for a lot of people. But even though those are the earliest dates that have been found in English, and it seems to originally have been kind of borrowed from similar terms in French. These terms were still rarely used in the early decades of the 20th century in English. So, for instance, the pioneering civil rights activist and journalist Ida B. Wells, she used phrases like race hatred and race prejudice, for instance, in her memoir, Crusade for Justice. She began writing that in 1928 and left it unfinished when she died 3 years later. But you won't find the word racism in what she wrote. So when Merriam-Webster published the second edition of its unabridged New International Dictionary in 1934, that word racism was nowhere to be found. The editors, it just wasn't on their radar, basically. But they did make room for another related term, which was more popular and then ended up kind of being in competition with it for a few decades, and that was racialism, defined as racial characteristics, tendencies, prejudices, or the like, specifically race hatred. So that word racism, though, was still just not one that they thought merited inclusion, or perhaps they were not even aware of it in 1934. That all changed thanks to an observation by one of the members of the editorial staff named Ruth Frances Egan. She was an assistant editor for the second edition of that big New International Unabridged Dictionary. And she was also in charge of writing entries for another book they were publishing called Webster's Dictionary of Synonyms. And so she was working on that for several years at the same time as she was an assistant editor for the Unabridged. Now, editors at Merriam-Webster's office in Springfield, Massachusetts, before the advent of email, communicated with each other by exchanging notes on pink slips of paper. These slips are still known affectionately at Merriam-Webster as the pinks, and they're all still filed away in the Springfield archive. So here, thanks to friends at Merriam-Webster who helped dig this up for me, this is the handwritten slip that tells the story exactly of how that word racism entered the dictionary. So this slip was dated November 1st, 1938. It was initiated by Ruth Egan, and she was asking her fellow editor, John Bethel, about the status of this word. Now, this slip is a bit hard to read. I'll help you decipher it here. You could see under the word racism, Ruth Egan writes, "Mr. Bethel, has this term been entered in the addenda? I wanted to use it in a DS and found that it is not in W34. Egan knew that there was no entry yet in Webster's New International of 1934, is what she's saying, but inquired whether it was slated for future printings as part of the addenda, the section in the front of the dictionary for new words that came to the editor's attention too late for inclusion in the main text. So, and when Egan said she wanted to use it in a DS, that was short for a discriminated synonym, which was what they called the items that were considered in the entries of this dictionary of synonyms that she was working on. Basically, any word that appeared in one of these secondary works that they were publishing had to also appear in the big unabridged dictionary. So she's asking, I want to put this in the synonyms dictionary. Why isn't it in the unabridged? Can we add it to the addenda? So sure enough, later on, when the Dictionary of Synonyms was first published a few years later, it included an entry with the word racism in it. And it was in this paragraph that was teasing apart differences between the words citizen, subject, and national. Again, these are good Raymond Williams style keywords that we're dealing with here. And so this sentence was included in that. There is also a tendency to prefer national to subject or citizen in some countries where the sovereign power is not clearly vested in a monarch or ruler or in the people, or where theories of racism prevail. Now, what could she have been talking about at the time? Likely she had in mind Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws, which had been passed in 1935 and stripped Jews of their citizenship while remaining subjects of the Reich. Indeed, when the word racism appeared in print in the late 1930s, it was mostly in the context of European fascism under Hitler and Mussolini. And just 1 week after Egan made her inquiry about racism in November 1938, German Jews were attacked in the Nazi pogrom known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And a few weeks later, the activist Jesuit priest Father John Lafarge Jr. Spoke out against racism in an address in New York. And here you can see a newspaper account of his address. And in the headline, that word racism is in kind of scare quotes. It was still a new word for most people. And the article says, warning that the destructive forces of racism are increasing in the United States, the Reverend John Lafarge, Catholic writer, said that these elements would cause untold harm among the people if immediate steps are not taken to combat them. American racism, Father Lafarge said, is directed principally against Negroes, foreigners, and Jews. He described it as the pale but venomous elder cousin of Nazi racism. So you can see how the discourse about this new word racism, which was focused so much on Nazi Germany, then causes Americans to talk about racism on the home front. And this is just this particular word and this sort of label for for this ends up becoming prominent at that time. So this context is all key for understanding how Egan and her fellow Merriam-Webster editors approach this word racism. So on the same slip as her initial inquiry is a checklist of various sources, but the word was not found in any current dictionary that she checked. So no dictionary had any entry on racism, although, as I mentioned, racialism, this other word, sometimes appeared. So Egan realized that this needed to be added to Merriam-Webster, and after she queried her fellow editor about it, subsequent slips from November 1938 show early attempts by the lexicographers at defining the word. At the time, Nazi Germany was clearly on everyone's minds. So one draft definition starts off with calling it racialism, again, this other term that was being used, but then says especially a doctrine characteristic of totalitarian ideology, that national divisions should correspond to racial divisions, and that the racial stock of the nation should be kept pure from admixture. Here's another draft. They went through various drafts and discussed this. I mean, it's fascinating to be able to sort of see the actual kind of artifacts of this whole editorial process. In this one, racism, the definition spells out the context more explicitly. It adds the more specific sense, the Nazi assumption of Teutonic superiority and attendant anti-Semitism. So really kind of limiting it to that context. But that's ultimately not how it got defined. There were further editorial arguments back and forth, and these Nazi references were removed from the definition, and the entry as it appeared in the addenda of the 1939 printing of the New International, second edition, reads, assumption of inherent racial superiority, or the purity and superiority of certain races, and consequent discrimination against other races. Also, any doctrine or program of racial domination and discrimination based on such an assumption. So this was the first definition of the word racism published in any major English dictionary. The entry would eventually get overhauled for the third edition of the New International, that one that I was talking about before, the one that removed the word fuck from its pages. So Philip B. Gove, the editor-in-chief, and his staff determined that racism, which was no longer so associated with Nazi ideology, you don't see references, again, to sort of purism or these other words that suggest that was the context of use. But now instead we get a sense that racism primarily referred to personal beliefs about racial superiority. But you can see, like what we were looking at before, those senses 2A and 2B, they still allowed that racism could relate to institutional forces embedding implicit bigotry more broadly in society. So it's interesting that this definition actually held up for several decades before it finally got revised in 2020. In fact, a version of this definition would have been what Kennedy Mitchum would have seen when she consulted Merriam-Webster's online dictionary in June 2020. And so, again, you can sort of see that the story of this particular keyword is far more complex than just, saying, here's this word, it entered the language, here's how the dictionary defines it. Once you start digging into the story, not just of the use of the word, but the way that lexicographers have sort of grappled with how do we define this word, you can see it opens up so much more in terms of like the nuances and the way that this has changed over time. In fact, Merriam-Webster, even before they made this online revision in 2020, they recognized that they needed to sort of address this term, this keyword, in a more nuanced way. And they did something, they added an extended note about the history and dictionary meaning of racism. So this is one of the benefits of online dictionaries these days. They can be edited on the fly, actually. Editors can add notes like this as they see fit. And so this particular note was added, and you can see that the note discusses how the word racism only dates back to the early 20th century, even though the concept, of course, existed long before that. And then there's this interesting note of caution. Dictionaries are often treated as the final arbiter in arguments over a word's meaning, but they are not always well suited for settling disputes. Now, this is certainly true when dealing with such a charged word as racism, but this note really resonates with the observations that Raymond Williams was making about dictionary entries being used for rhetorical purposes. And that certainly hasn't changed since Williams wrote about that in Keywords, even if now people are consulting online dictionaries to try to settle arguments. So this entry for racism, it was no doubt overdue for a change in 2020, and it's worth thinking back on how the dictionary, Merriam-Webster in this case, has tried to grapple with the term ever since Egan noticed it was in need of defining. Laying out the semantics of a term like this has always been a balancing act between what scholars on race like Camera Phyllis Jones have identified as institutionalized racism on the one hand and personally mediated or internalized racism on the other. So with the institutionalized side of racism coming to the fore in current discourse in the US and elsewhere, dictionaries, of course, need to reflect that change of emphasis. So, I mean, what all this suggests is that definitions are never set in stone, and the twists and turns of how racism has been defined illustrate how the meanings of contentious keywords are always subject to reevaluation and contestation. I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions. Okay. Thank you.
How does fe relate to meh?
Yes, so meh and fe are both Yiddish interjections, and I spent some time trying to see if there were any clear connections between the two, and failed to do that. I did find that, for instance, they kind of went on different pathways in terms of how they got popularized. So readers of Mad magazine, for instance, would have been familiar with fe. I spent a lot of time actually looking through old issues of Mad magazine, trying to find meh, and came up empty. I only found fe and some other Yiddishisms, of course, as that Mad magazine writers put in there. But yeah, this is the type of research that I end up just like, you know, finding Mad magazine digital copies and hoping to find meh in there. But yeah, somebody's got to do it.
Thanks for your talk. I'm actually kind of wondering about sort of the speed at which entries get added to the dictionary, because I was just looking like the list of words that were added to Merriam-Webster's 2023 new words list, and like one of them was, say, freestyle. Just in my own experience, I feel like freestyle has probably been around for generations. You know, it's just been around, or seemingly it's been around.
Referring to freestyle rap? I
think so, but you know, I think it's been around for, you know, since at least my childhood, I would guess. You know, but I would guess that's, even if it's not as charged as a word as racism, are words like these, you know, or just the words that are added to Merriam-Webster always subject to like a, you know, 20-year, 30-year sort of process of review? I mean, I know you've talked about how, you know, different meanings, you know, get contested and they're, you know, discussed by editors all the time. I'm just wondering, is like, are all words that get added to the dictionary get this, you know, decades-long process before they're finally given, you know?
Well, it depends, of course. And the different dictionary programs have different criteria for what they consider, you know, dictionary-worthy entries. Very often, though, if it's a word that is just being added and you're like, well, this has been around, I'm sure, that doesn't mean that they were sort of like holding on to it and saying that this, you know, couldn't be added until we were sure that it was in more common use. Sometimes there are oversights that only get corrected over time. Again, lexicographers are human beings and often working in sort of understaffed editorial departments. Even the Oxford English Dictionary, or maybe especially the Oxford English Dictionary, because they try to cover so much, can end up having these gaps of coverage that may take years or decades to finally get to by the time entries are drafted. At the OED, typically they look for continued sort of mainstream use of a term for 10 years before they can say, yes, this is something that needs to be included. Oxford dictionaries, as well as Merriam-Webster, certainly changed that particular kind of waiting period when COVID happened. Words like COVID went into the dictionary immediately. There was no question that that was going to be included, and they had some very quick turnaround in order to have COVID and coronavirus and related terms like that enter. Now, those are obviously high-profile words that they can expect to be wanting dictionary definitions, and those get a lot of attention and priority. But there are, so many other words that might sort of go under the radar for a long time without proper attention.
Do you want to call on someone?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks again for your talk. I was curious, thinking back to keywords and how they comprise many different meanings. I was wondering if you've seen in your research certain keywords atomizing into different new words, or a series of interrelated words sort of combining to become a new keyword.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you very often, and this is something, again, that Raymond Williams, I think, considered, is sort of the connections between keywords and then how they may generate new forms, so that, even in the example that we were talking about, the word race, that's a keyword. But like how is it used, for instance, in combining forms? And I mentioned how, for instance, what might have been called race hatred, then eventually gets called racialism or racism. And so certainly with terms that are kind of seen as central or significant to our discourse, they end up generating lots of new forms. That's just one way that our lexicon is constantly kind of regenerating in this way. And so, yeah, I mean, you can certainly see that with lots of terms, even, not just ones that we might call keywords in the sort of the Raymond Williams style. Just as an example, I happen to have a couple of slides here. If you consider just Zoom, I believe we have some people joining us and watching via Zoom, so it's appropriate. So one of the things that I work on is this feature among the new words in American speech. And, as soon as Zoom became this crucial, part of our lives during the pandemic era, that suddenly we have all of that kind of productivity of new forms. And so this was just this is an entry that I worked on. This is from the August 2021 issue of American Speech, talking about Zoom as a combining form or blend. And this is, you can see the Zoom party zoomed out and so forth, Zombie. And so we also, in the supplementary materials for Among the New Words, we will give a sort of OED style treatment for words, but drawing on lots of recent evidence and citations that might incorporate images as well as embedded audio and video clips. And you can see the zombie apocalypse there from that entry. And there were also people are having lots of fun with that at the time. We were talking about Yiddish. One sort of quasi-Yiddish term that came up was ausgezoomt, which literally meant sort of zoomed out, but using that in Yiddish style. So, this is the type of sort of natural productivity that we see with any word that sort of like becomes used so much that all sorts of, new productive forms can take flight as well.
Thank you. Being in Philadelphia, I was tempted to ask you to settle the dispute over the word John between New York and Philly, but I'm not going to do that. I'd rather ask a different question.
I have thoughts on that.
Well, you're the speaker, but my real question is, and Zoom's a perfect example because I was trying to think of one that had less heat to it, but the lexicographer, apparently, from what you were saying, looks for words to become mainstream. And there's a decision there's a inflection point after which a word is, in some sense, widespread enough to be dictionary worthy. Does it work the other way? And the example I was thinking of was Zoom was not the first innovative force in during COVID. It was a application called Blue Jeans. And all of these words could have been, you weren't a Zoom bee, you were a blue jean or whatever. But nobody talks about that anymore. So if blue jeans had hit the lexicon in 2000, is there a culling effort? And how does that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, so much of it, especially when it's related to technology, is kind of contingent on what people are using and what people are talking about. In terms of a culling effort, it's sort of unspoken, though, that dictionaries do actually remove words after they've been introduced at times. One example I know from working at Oxford University Press was the term information superhighway, which was put into the new Oxford American Dictionary in its first edition when Al Gore, for instance, in the 90s was using that term a lot. It was silently removed to make room for other things. So, that's an example where, something might have sort of be seen as culturally relevant and important and perhaps having staying power and, didn't end up having legs, as it were. With the Oxford English Dictionary, they never remove anything. So you can find everything that's ever been put in there. Other dictionaries have again different criteria for that. But as you say, you can sort of look back, and that's one interesting thing about working on Word of the Year is you can sort of look back at previous years about what we thought was important and thought, really, is that really what we were going with for that year? The very first Word of the Year chosen by the American Dialect Society back in 1990 was bush lips, which was never heard from again. Bush lips was defined as insincere political rhetoric because George H.W. Bush at the time had gone back on his promise of read my lips, no new taxes. So that made sense in 1990, but you look back and, but so Word of the Year can sometimes provide a glimpse of things that were sort of in the zeitgeist for that year. Then we will also sort of cover it, as I mentioned, in this feature Among the New Words, which was originally actually started more than 80 years ago in this Journal American Speech, specifically to try to fill in the gaps between sort of, dictionary additions and revisions. To basically say, well, we need to document these words somehow, and so we don't know if they'll stick around, but we're gonna we'll try to keep a record of all of it, and going back to the original columns or Among the New Words features written by Dwight Bollinger back in the 1940s, it's really fascinating to see what stuck around and what didn't. That particular feature doesn't have to worry about longevity the way that a dictionary might and say, oh, yeah, we think this is going to stick around. While we're talking about that, I just want to make a plug, though, for the American Dialect Society Word of the Year, which the selection will be held on January 10th, 2025, in conjunction with the LSA's annual meeting right here in Philadelphia at the Marriott downtown. So you are actually welcome to attend this if you'd like to sort of see how we go about doing this. You can also submit your own nominations. There's a bit.ly link there, and then we also have a QR code, if that works for anyone, perhaps. That will direct you to a survey that we've started doing with Professor Kelly Elizabeth Wright, who's at University of Wisconsin, has spearheaded the effort to get more nominations from the publics, because there's only so much that we can do, the folks who are involved in the Word of the Year process, in keeping track of things. And we've seen great responses from people young and old who sort of want to make nominations. And when we actually do hold our vote in January, we go through various categories first, like political Word of the Year, most likely to succeed or most useful, before we get to the overall winner. And it's a fun and interesting process. And you do not actually have to be a member of the American Dialect Society or Linguistic Society of America to participate in the process. And I believe when we hold the next one, there will be sort of guest passes for people who would like to attend. So just mark that on your calendar if you'd like to attend, and check on americandialect.org for more information about that process and how you can become a member of the ADS. You can, for a reasonable price, get a membership that includes a subscription to American Speech, and you can read all of those installments of Among the New Words that we work on, and lots of other very interesting material on American English and in other languages in the US.
What about the John? I think there's people in this audience who would like to know your take on
Okay.
John.
You're not prohibited.
Okay. Yeah. So I spent some time sort of trying to find early. Again, this is another case where written records, written evidence will only take you so far. But there's enough to sort of piece things together through the 80s and into the 90s, when it becomes more popular, to say that it is sort of a Philadelphia take on joint as used in songs like That's the Joint, an early rap song from circa 82, 83, and that becomes then sort of widened semantically. And then there are other regional variations, though, not just in Philly, but in Baltimore and so forth, all kind of reflecting the phonology of that dialect. And so, you can say that, it may have originated semantically in a way from, hip hop having its birth in New York, and songs like That's the Joint, which I mentioned, coming out of New York. But then it's really the sort of the Philly take on that to kind of expand it semantically and give it its own kind of phonological shape, which is, how it continues to get used. That's my short take on it.
I'm just wondering if there's a reason you're not telling people that crucial detail about Lila's definition of fuck.
Well,
is it polite company?
I figured time didn't permit, and also we were having trouble with the video. But if do you want to elaborate yourself on that?
I mean, I'm wondering if maybe you're going to write about this in the future. So I don't want to spill the beans.
Spill away.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was interested to hear that Merriam-Webster published the definition in 1973, which was also the year that Roe versus Wade was decided by the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until the next year, 1974, that women were allowed to hold credit cards in their own names. So 1973, okay, so what was the year Lila wrote the definition? 1958? 58, yeah. Okay.
She didn't write it, but she
submitted it to her boss, and they had a big argument. And the argument, and the reason why it probably didn't get in until 1973, honestly, was because the argument was about, was the word symmetrical or not?
Right.
And the boss said, not symmetrical, and Lila said, symmetrical.
Okay, so to spell that out in more detail, basically the argument between Lila Gleitman and Harold Rashkis was basically whether the verb fuck requires a male subject and female object. And believe it or not, that was a common understanding of that word by people like Harold Rashkis. Now, what was drafted, I didn't sort of show in detail, in that reflected the Gleitman view that does not, it can be symmetrical. So two people, regardless of gender and so forth, either one can take the subject or object position, or they both can together take the subject position.
So John just isn't the only one who's able to shake Jane's hand. Jane and John can shake hands.
Right, as an example of a symmetrical verb. Which
I love that. I mean, I think it was an early feminist position.
Absolutely. And I don't think that was particularly the sticking point at Springfield among, that memo that I showed was not saying we can't let this in the dictionary because it implies something about, the roles of men and women in the use of that verb. It was a more general contention. But what was interesting was that Gove and his editors clearly took the advice of Lila Gleitman when they drafted that, and that was maintained through until when it finally saw the light of day in 1973. In the meantime, there was, in fact, a British dictionary, I think the Penguin Dictionary, which took this more like asymmetric approach, which suggested it's something a man does to a woman. So that was still out there. But yes, thanks to Lila Gleitman, that particular view was not carried forth in both the both Merriam-Webster and other American dictionaries. That American Heritage Dictionary actually beat Merriam-Webster to the punch by putting it in, again, in sort of the Lila Gleitman style from in 1969, I think. So yeah, there's a lot more to be said, and I hope to, elaborate on that in more detail in a future piece.
I just have to ask, what is your favorite word?
Yeah, that's not fair. That's not fair. That answer will sort of depend on just how I'm feeling at a particular moment, or what's struck my fancy. When I was younger and joining the National Puzzlers League and looking up these archaic words in unabridged dictionaries, I was sort of struck by one word, I think also a favorite of Will Short's, which was euchelagon, which appeared in the second edition, that one from 1934, but was taken out of the third edition. Euchelagon's defined as a neighbor whose house is on fire. It's fascinating, though, when old archaic words sometimes get new life. And so one of my favorite words from 2024 is herkel-durkel, which I wrote about in another column for the Wall Street Journal, which is a term that you will find in old Scottish dictionaries from the early 19th century as a dialectal term and used as a verb or a noun, but meaning to lie in bed when you should be getting up and doing things. And so just when you have responsibilities, you just decide to herkel-durkel. Now there's a lexicographer in the UK named Susie Dent who shared this on social media. That got picked up by people on Instagram who were sort of like posting about herkel-durkeling, and suddenly that became a thing that people were talking about on TikTok and so forth. So I love that just as an example of how, it just so happened that, because Susie Dent loved this old word, she shared it with people, it resonated with people, and now herkel-durkeling has a whole sort of new life. So for now, I'm going to say herkel-durkel is my favorite.
Ben, this is really wonderful. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the history of the word of the year.
Sure.
You already answered one of my questions, which was, how often do you get it wrong? That this is not an enduring word. And I'm curious when it started, how long it's been going on, and how often the picks have been words that did endure. And then I want to add, I don't know if this is the same question or another, but as the parent of a 12-year-old, I want to know how you deal with generational specific slang. I mean, there's a lot of Riz and Skibbity in my household. And what happens to those? And do those, how long does it take for those to disappear as well?
Well, as I mentioned, the American Dialect Society started doing it in 1990. That was the year of bush lips. And it was a fellow named Alan Metcalf who came up with the idea to do it. Originally, it was an idea to sort of bring some more publicity to the American Dialect Society and what the scholars there do by just having a fun thing that might be picked up by the media that would be sort of the equivalent of Times Person of the Year. And so originally it was a relatively smaller group of scholars who met and made that choice back in 1990. Over the years, it's sort of grown to be a bigger event, as I mentioned, because we meet in conjunction with the Linguistic Society of America, a much larger group. It's become sort of like an event that everybody wants to show up for, and so we fill up a big ballroom every year, except for the COVID years where we did it via Zoom. And so in terms of how often, we get things right, I don't think that we're necessarily concerned with thinking of that necessarily. And, we say that we want to capture, like, as the overall word of the year, something that sort of really captures the zeitgeist of the moment. And, looking back, as some observers have sort of like gone through and looked at which ones have succeeded and which haven't. Obviously, bush lips is a sort of notorious example, but, in 2008 or 9, I guess, 2000, what year was it? Maybe 07. Whenever Pluto got demoted from planetary status, whatever year that was, the winning word for that year was the verb to Pluto, meaning to demote. But you don't hear people talking about getting Plutoed. That's sometimes it often is because you're getting a group of linguists together. It can be something that's more linguistically interesting in some ways. And so, in past years we've had, because plus a noun or adjective or other use of because that was big about 10 or so years ago. And I'm not sure it's so popular these days, but it was certainly a very interesting kind of linguistic moment. Other things that have been noted that, again, are sort of more linguistically interested, singular they was selected not just for word of the year, but word of the decade for the previous decade. And that's certainly one that you can see has had tremendous staying power. And so, yeah, in terms of getting things right, I don't know. I mean, again, we have a category most likely to succeed where we try to at least think about that sort of long term, but generally we're not too concerned about that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, like basically it's very often in that ballroom, whoever kind of like makes the compelling argument and gets people to vote, and then I get to be the one to talk about, say, enshittification, which was the choice for last year, which I think was a good choice, actually. And that, that had to do with the way that so many of our kind of online platforms seem to be getting worse over time due to, various forces sort of in the marketplace working to make these things that used to work well, like, say, Amazon or Twitter/X or whatever, get enshittified, as Cory Doctorow ended up using the term, and that caught off. And now you do hear that often, not just about online platforms, but various other things. And that was also kind of, linguistically interesting as well. In terms of your question just about generational slang, yeah, I mean, obviously we've had in recent years, there's been a sort of a big influx of not just Gen Z, but now Gen Alpha slang. And you mentioned Riz and Skibbity. We talk about these things and puzzle over them. Riz actually came up in both 2022 and 2023 discussions. In 2022, it was just sort of taking off. and didn't get as much attention. In 2023, you could see that it had become not just this sort of very popular form, but was sort of like spreading in all sorts of interesting directions as well. It will be interesting to see this year in terms of the, how terms like skibbity and various other things that seem to be rather nonsensical, but then have a usage perhaps not that different from some of the playful slang that you could see from the 1920s versus the 2020s that become just sort of generational markers more than anything else. So that's all considered, and we have, a category for sort of slang/informal terms, and those terms often sort of, get discussed there, and sometimes we'll see if one of those ends up being overall word of the year this time. Okay, one more question.
And this will be our last question, I think.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. This is from one of our Zoom viewers who is an amateur lexicographer, and they are asking tips. What skills would you recommend someone develop if they want to do some rigorous word sleuthing and to help them build their craft if they don't work for dictionaries? And how and where do you usually find new words?
Those are great questions, and it's always great to hear of young people who are interested in this type of thing. I've been in touch recently with some sort of Gen Z budding lexicographers who have been actually trying to sort of keep track themselves of new forms. There's a whole group actually that contributes to Wiktionary, which is it's user generated the way that Wikipedia is, and sort of this crowdsourced effort. And is kind of growing by leaps and bounds because there's a kind of a critical mass of folks who are interested in really trying to get this right. And if a new term is sort of coming to the language, trying to incorporate that into Wiktionary. And there's a whole kind of community around that now with its own Discord server where they're actually talking about these things, like, well, trying to sort of figure out on their own kind of how to do lexicography. And so I admire that. In terms of like tips that I might give, I would say that sort of, familiarizing yourself with the way that that dictionaries treat language and looking for the things that might be missing, but appreciating, perhaps appreciating the sort of the linguistic structure as well. I would, for college-age students, I would definitely recommend, at least an intro linguistics course where you're thinking seriously about, parts of speech and morphology and phonology and syntax and that sort of thing can sort of help you sort of structure your thinking about these things. And then there are so many places like online these days where interesting discussions are going on. And so there are whole Reddit discussions in addition to other places like that. I again would recommend just checking out Among the New Words, which I mentioned, as a way that to see how new forms can be sort of given the lexicographical treatment of the type that you might see in the OED, even if they're brand new. And sort of try to think seriously too about if there's a word, we were talking about skibbity. I'm not going to attempt to define that now. That would be a whole different talk. But thinking about semantic nuances, but also, what in linguistics are called sort of the pragmatics of speech, how the actual context of use may come into play as well in a way, as I discussed in my talk, can be sometimes difficult to encompass in a dictionary definition, but I applaud those who are sort of interested in, finding out more, and they're welcome to track me down as well. I'm pretty easy to find online for more advice.
On that note, let's thank Ben for a great talk.